In 1977, an engineer working at the Taito Corporation started creating the game that would define the core principle of video game design. The engineer's name was Tomohiro Nishikado, and the game in question was Space Invaders. Nishikado had created several video games before this, including Interceptor, Speed Race, and Gunfight. For Space Invaders, he had two primary goals. The first was to create something similar to the Atari game Breakout. In Nishikado's game, this meant that the player would control a small avatar that shot at layered targets on the other side of the screen. His second goal was to employ American-made microprocessors, a technology that he had never used before. Because of his inexperience with that technology, he accidentally set up the game so that as the player destroyed the ships of the enemy swarm, the remaining enemies started to move faster. The player's tank avatar, on the other hand, stayed the same speed. Rather than reconfigure the hardware to eliminate this dynamic, Nishikado decided to keep it as a feature of the game's design. In doing so, he created the idea which defined mainstream video game design and accidentally stumbled upon the central theme of video game design history. My name is Patrick Holloman. For the past 7 years, I've been writing about the history of video game design. My biggest project was called the Reverse Design Series, a set of books which looked at 6 classic video games and reverse engineered all of the design decisions that went into them. Those books were long and technical, full of graphs, charts, figures, and other large collections of data. Now, I've switched to video in order to make those lessons accessible to a wider audience. I'm going to try to leave the really dry and detailed stuff in the background, but I think it helps to know that it's there. If you ever want to check out the original source material from which these videos are drawn, I'll always throw in links to the original books or articles. But this series is just supposed to extract the best lessons from the books, so I'm calling it the Game Design Extracts. In this, the first episode, we are going to look at the overall history of video game design, starting with Space Invaders and going all the way up to the present. This serves as a good introduction to some of the theoretical ideas which will reappear numerous times in this series. The highest level idea I want to convey is that video game design history breaks down into 3 eras: the arcade era, the composite era, and the set-piece era. Let's go back to Space Invaders, which is in the arcade era. In Space Invaders, Nishikado had created a difficulty structure which looks like this. Every level starts at a low difficulty, and then gets more challenging as the player gets closer to defeating the alien swarm. Then, to embellish that effect, Nishikado also set up each successive level to start at a slightly higher level of difficulty by moving the alien swarm one row closer. Many critics and researchers have called this a series of ascending arcs, although you'll hear me refer to it as Nishikado motion. But the important thing to know is that this difficulty structure is the central principle of video game design, one that is repeated in almost all mainstream games up until the present day. There are lots of methods that designers use to push the difficulty upwards or downwards according to the principle of Nishikado motion. In the arcade era, the most common way of doing this was by changing the enemies or obstacles along 3 important dimensions: numbers, strength, and timing. In Space Invaders, the game gets harder via timing. The alien swarm closes in on the player more and more quickly. In Asteroids, the game uses timing and number. The asteroids become faster and more numerous as the player shoots them. Missile Command's difficulty also grows along the lines of timing and number, as the missiles rain down more quickly and in greater quantity as the game goes on. After Nishikado's discovery, the next most important development in the arcade era was the power-up. Quite a few different games experimented with some kind of power-up mechanic. Phoenix doubles the player's firing speed in the second phase of the game. Galaga famously doubled the player's firepower with its 2 ships power-up. The most iconic power-up of the arcade era was probably Pac-Man's Power Pellet. When Pac-Man gained this power-up, he gained the ability to eat the ghost enemies who would actually flee from him during the pellet's effect. The Power Pellet is a great example of what these power-ups were doing during the arcade era. Like the enhanced firepower of Galaga's 2 ships power-up, the Power Pellet made playing Pac-Man easier, although only for a short time. Really, these power-ups were just backdoors into changes in numbers, strength, and timing. Rather than making the enemies stronger or weaker, the designers of Galaga and Pac-Man were able to recreate that effect by making the player's avatar stronger or weaker instead. For instance, the duration of the power pellet decays over the course of the game, giving the player less and less of an advantage. This creates the same overall effect as typical NST alterations. The most important power-up to come out of the arcade era in terms of advancing the discipline of video game design was the invention of a young Shigeru Miyamoto. Interestingly, Miyamoto was one of the first great game designers to see Nishikado's breakthrough for what it was. In an interview with Time magazine, Miyamoto was asked which one game revolutionized the video game industry. His response was, "Space Invaders. Before I saw it, I was never particularly interested in video games, and certainly never thought I would make video games." In his first game, Donkey Kong, Miyamoto put Nishikado's design structure to work, but he also made his own important discovery. The protagonist of Donkey Kong, Jumpman, starts out with a set of platformer abilities. He can run, jump, and climb, but he has to avoid any and all hazards thrown at him. Once he picks up the hammer power-up, however, he loses the ability to climb and jump, but gains the ability to attack. Or, in other words, the game temporarily stops being a platformer and becomes an action game. In this, Miyamoto had discovered something that was potentially revolutionary. What if the secret lay in combining two genres and moving back and forth between their respective skill sets? As with Nishikado's great discovery in Space Invaders, Miyamoto's first small experiment with a genre-changing power-up was probably serendipity. The hammer is totally optional, and it actually doesn't help Jumpman very much. Many really skilled Donkey Kong players don't use it at all. But the hammer power-up was nevertheless unique. Pac-Man had experimented with a power-up that shifted the player from defensive to offensive play, but Pac-Man doesn't lose any abilities like Jumpman does. Even though the hammer was mostly a throw-in idea, its design implications would be incredibly important for the history of video game design. After 1983, the video games market entered a major recession. There were several reasons for this. To some degree, the public simply lost interest in video games, in one of the boom and bust cycles that are inherent in many entertainment products. It certainly didn't help that the market was saturated with shovelware-type games like the infamous E.T. for the Atari 2600. But I think that there were game design reasons for the collapse as well. Arcade-style games have a limited design vocabulary. If you think about it, what else can Space Invaders, Galaga, Missile Command, or Asteroids do except push the numbers, strength, and timing of its enemies? There's nowhere else for them to go with their core design ideas, and this can get boring. This isn't supposed to be an indictment of the designers of those games, though. The arcade machines of the early 1980s lacked the power to do many different things at once, and the arcade classics did amazingly well with what they had. But excusable or not, the arcade style of narrowly defined and extremely difficult gameplay got old for a lot of people, further contributing to the great video games crash of the early 1980s. When video games became popular again toward the end of the decade, it would be thanks to new technology and a new style of video game design which that technology made possible. In 1985, Nintendo released Super Mario Bros., inaugurating a new era in video game design. Between the breakout success of Donkey Kong and the launch of Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto had some significant successes, including some Donkey Kong sequels and the two-player arcade title Mario Bros., which greatly refined the platformer mechanics of the earlier games. But with the new power of the Nintendo Famicom at their disposal, Miyamoto and his team were able to fundamentally change the way that video games were designed. After a few years, this led to renewed worldwide interest in video games. Super Mario Bros. Expands on the idea that first appeared in Donkey Kong. In Donkey Kong, Jumpman could momentarily switch from platformer powers to action game powers, and then back again. In Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto and his team achieved something similar through level design. Level 1-2, for example, emphasizes Mario's action abilities with its frequent low ceilings and many enemies. Level 1-3, on the other hand, emphasizes his platformer abilities, with fewer enemies and narrower and more widely spaced platforms. Neither level ever totally abandons platformer or action mechanics. They just emphasize different things. Super Mario Bros. Is, at all times, both a platformer and an action game. I call this the composite style of video game design, and the games this style makes, composite games. A composite game has three important characteristics. The first is that it combines two genres. In the case of Super Mario Bros., those genres are platformers and action games. The second characteristic is that it allows the player to use the skills of one genre to solve the problems of another genre. In Super Mario Bros., that means Mario can use a platforming skill, jumping, to solve action game problems, like defeating enemies. The third characteristic of composite games is that the gameplay moves back and forth between genres in a regular way, without ever dropping either genre. It always maintains a little of both genres, but different parts of the game emphasize one genre over another. We saw this in the way that levels 1-2 and 1-3 leaned towards either action or platformer content, but always kept the mechanics from both genres intact. Eventually, Miyamoto and his collaborators realized that the best way to emphasize this back-and-forth motion between genres was to use genre-changing power-ups, just like they had done in Donkey Kong. In Super Mario Bros. 3, the Raccoon Tail and the Fire Flower represent an emphasis on platformer and action genres, respectively. The Cape and Fire Flower in Super Mario World do the same. In this, the Nintendo designers had realized something profoundly important about video game design. Back in the arcade era, video game designers began to move the difficulty of their games up and down by altering the number, strength, and timing of their obstacles. As such, when we visualize Nishikado motion, we can measure those arcade-style changes on an axis of obstacles. But Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World also introduced another axis, an axis of abilities. If gameplay in the arcade era moved up and down the axis of obstacles to keep the player interested, composite games keep the player interested in an additional way. By moving back and forth between genres, the game maintains the player's interest. As soon as one genre's skills or mechanics start to get a little stale, the designer can switch the focus of the next level to the complementary genre. Composite games still exhibit Nishikado motion, but the difficulty curves are not as steep because the designers can also rely on the qualitative genre changes to keep the player from getting bored. Early on, Nintendo design practices were way ahead of the rest of the industry, a supremacy they would retain until the advent of the PlayStation. But composite design practices were quickly, if sometimes inexpertly, imitated throughout the industry. After the release of Super Mario Bros., composite games quickly became the industry standard. The 1980s and early 1990s saw a wide range of composites. Designers combined the platformer and shooter genres, the racing and shooter genres, and a huge variety of composites of the action and RPG genres. Indeed, some of the genres of games we think of as unique were actually composites of existing genres. The best example of this is the real-time strategy genre, which is actually a mashup of economic simulations, traditional strategy, and real-time overhead action games. We think of that genre as unique, but its fundamental parts were entirely lifted from existing genres. Composite design almost completely displaced the arcade style. Part of this can be explained in terms of design. Composite games can maintain the interest of the player without using punishing difficulty curves. That fact greatly expanded the potential audience of video games. Another reason for the ascendance of the composite game is commercial and technological. Although home gaming consoles existed in the early 1980s, their power and market share increased dramatically in the 1990s. Eventually, it made more sense for video game developers to design specifically for home consoles rather than for arcades that run on quarters. Design trends changed accordingly. Composite games remain popular today. Designers still combine genres in much the same way that Miyamoto first started doing in the 1980s. The FPS RPG hybrid is a popular contemporary genre composite, but it's hardly the only one. Portal, for example, follows the principles of composite design perfectly. Portal allows the player to use FPS mechanics, shooting, to solve platformer problems, jumping to new platforms. And it bounces back and forth between platformer-centric and FPS-centric content across the course of the game. There are plenty of other innovative composites which build fresh experiences out of existing genres. Games like League of Legends combine the controls and UI of the RTS with a deep roster of RPG-style weapons and abilities. The Smash Bros. Franchise combines fighting games with platformer mechanics in a deeply compelling way. Every combination of genres is unique, and the composite style of design will probably remain viable indefinitely. That said, starting around 1998, a new game design style came along to coexist with composite games, and inaugurated the third era of video game design, the set-piece era. The third era of video game design, the set-piece era, is a little different from the first two. The arcade and composite eras had clear beginnings. Space Invaders and Super Mario Bros. Were breakthrough games that changed the video game design paradigm forever. The set-piece era was a little more gradual in developing. I put the date of it at about 1998, because that's when Half-Life came out. Half-Life brought together many of the design trends that were central to the set-piece era, but it wasn't a sudden surge forward, like Space Invaders or Super Mario Bros. Half-Life built on design strategies that originally began in games like Doom, GoldenEye, Quake, and Time Crisis. Nevertheless, those design ideas assumed their contemporary form and became much more widespread after 1998. But let's take a step back and look at what a set-piece game is and how and why it came into being. Just as technological constraints led to the creation of Space Invaders, production constraints led to the proliferation of set-piece games. Originally, even big-name video game development teams were fairly small, but as video game production teams grew in size and in budget, it was inevitable that video game productions would begin to take on the structure of large consumer software companies. For example, one Western software development strategy that crept into video game development divides teams into two parts. On top, there is the vision side of the project, which has a lead artist, a lead programmer, and a lead designer. Those leads develop tools and/or templates for the development of the game, while junior programmers, designers, and artists would use those tools and templates to implement content. Those two groups always have to communicate, and ideas flow in both directions, but the stratified structure of this style of development, combined with the increasing technical and financial demands of 3D games, affected the way that games were designed. Instead of throwing a dozen or more short challenges featuring an array of mechanics at a player, Western games of the late 90s and beyond tended to focus on a smaller number of longer encounters that I call set pieces. Set pieces have three important characteristics. Set pieces are extended. Compared to composite game challenges, set pieces take an extended amount of time to complete. Most of the challenges in an earlier composite game can be dealt with in a few seconds, but a set piece tends to take anywhere from 30 seconds to as many as 5 minutes to complete. Some of this is just designer preference. Some people like games with lots of small challenges, and some people like games with a few big ones. But the overall trend towards fewer, larger set pieces probably had a lot to do with the increased amount of work necessary to develop 3D environments and the content that goes into them. It makes more sense for those environments to see a few minutes of use rather than just a few seconds. Set pieces are self-contained. Self-containment here means two things. First, set pieces tend not to overlap with one another. Modern shooter set pieces tend to take place in large rooms separated by long stretches of narrow corridors. The corridors often have a few traps or enemies in them, but even adjacent set pieces rarely interact. Self-containment also means that each set piece contains the resources necessary for completing it, or for returning to default conditions afterwards. Half-Life does this by having enemies drop ammo, and by putting health machines or health packs in the hallways between set pieces. Later games would accomplish the same thing by implementing regenerating shields or health, which automatically return characters to a standard level of health. But why do this? One explanation comes from production constraints. Let's say there are 10 set pieces in a level, and the level takes an hour to complete. The designers spend a lot of time getting the difficulty of those set pieces to rise and fall according to the principles of Nishikado motion. The level is beautifully crafted and flows really well. But what if the player makes a mistake and barely survives set piece 7? The checkpoint system saves their game with barely any health. Should that player have to restart the whole level? Should the designers have to rebalance everything? And what if several different designers are working on the level at the same time? Coordinating all of that could get really difficult. That's where self-containment comes in. If every set piece restores the player's health and ammo, either before or after the action begins, the designers don't have to worry about the inter-set piece balancing as much. This is especially useful for games with really long set pieces and large design staffs. Set pieces have a quantitative focus. Composite games tend to feature a fairly broad array of game mechanics which change qualitatively across the course of the game. Small teams making 2D games can experiment with dozens of mechanics because the development cycle for each mechanic is so short. Adding a mechanic that only appears in 2 levels isn't that strange in that context. Additionally, qualitative changes suit the voice of composite games really well. Composite games get a lot of their appeal from keeping the gameplay fresh without using steep difficulty curves, and the accumulation of small mechanical changes is a great way to make that happen. In big-budget 3D games, these qualitative changes are a little more difficult to implement and a lot more expensive. Therefore, set-piece games tend to develop more quantitatively. Although the level and terrain design of set pieces might vary qualitatively, the obstacles the player faces evolve more like arcade games, through changes in the numbers, strength, and timing of enemies. For example, in this Halo set piece, the difficulty hinges on how often these dropships come, and how many enemies they each deploy. The same idea applies to the most memorable set pieces in Call of Duty. Both games introduce almost all of their mechanics immediately, and add very few new ones after the first third of the game. But peaks and valleys driven by changes in NST variables keep the game interesting. I should back up just a bit here and say that set-piece games are not arcade games. Arcade games were defined by narrow, steep difficulty curves and very little qualitative change. Set-piece games don't fall back into that, or at least not completely. Moreover, it's actually possible for a set-piece game to be a composite game as well. Portal is, again, a great example of this. It brilliantly combines the platformer and shooter genres, and is clearly a composite game. But it also delivers its content as longer, self-contained set pieces, and therefore has aspects of both types of game. Based on my examples, you might have noticed that set-piece games tend to be predominantly first-person shooters, and that's certainly true. The years between 1998 and 2010 saw an almost ridiculous amount of FPS releases. But other genres implemented the set-piece design style as well. World of Warcraft's Dungeons and Raids, for example, clearly meet the extended and self-contained criteria, and the underlying RPG systems add that quantitative dimension. Later entries in the Grand Theft Auto series managed to implement set-piece style content even in an open-world context through missions and takeovers. I also want to give a few disclaimers here at the end of this video. First, this history of video game design does not include, and was not meant to include, every video game ever made. This is definitely a history of mainstream video game design. It also doesn't say nearly enough about RPG history, which I hope to cover in a later video. The purpose of this video is merely to lay down a theoretical framework which this series will build on in the future. Also, since I first started working on the theoretical history of video games back in 2011, things have changed a bit. Back in 2011, indie game development hadn't quite blossomed into the thing it is now. The explosion of niche and experimental games has definitely affected the history of video games, but it's too early to see how. So what can you expect from the rest of this series? There are already many YouTube channels that analyze games. Most of those channels focus on one game at a time. So rather than do the same thing, I'm going to try to cover topics in video game design, and then look at how those topics apply to a variety of games. And similar to the way I did in this video, I'm going to try to look at those topics in the context of video game design history. The game design extracts are supported by Patreon. Many thanks to the readers who followed me here to YouTube. Patreon backers have access to bonus videos not available on YouTube, and to the Game Design Forum Discord to ask questions and vote on new topics. In the future, I'll also put Patreon names in the credits. Thanks for watching.